There was no ammonia in the tank. That is the detail investigators kept returning to once they finally got it open in August of 2024, more than 3 years after Dee Warner vanished from her home in Franklin Township, Michigan. The tank had once held anhydrous ammonia, the kind used on industrial farms to fertilize soil. But by the time state police executed a search warrant on Dale Warner's property and pried it open, there was no ammonia inside. There was no chemical residue. There was no farm equipment being stored. There was a woman sealed inside, both ends welded shut, her mouth and nose duct taped before she went in, beaten, strangled, hidden inside a piece of farm equipment on the property of the man she had married 18 years earlier. The man who, 3 years before anyone found her, had already been arrested and charged with her murder before her body had ever been located. Investigators built an entire case, took it before a judge, and secured an arrest warrant for a murder where the only thing missing was the victim herself. They were right. It took them 3 years, 4 months, and dental records to prove it. But they were right from the very beginning. This is the case ledger. If this is your first time here, we follow evidence. We don't protect powerful people. We don't move on until the case moves. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what comes next in this one. Dee Warner was 52 years old. She had married Dale Warner in 2006. Both of them came into that marriage with 4 adult children, each from previous relationships, and together they had 1 more. What started as a marriage gradually folded into something else, a business partnership built around the farming and trucking operations that the Warner family ran out of Tecumseh, Michigan. By 2021, both the marriage and the businesses were struggling. Loans, low profits, payroll problems, the kind of financial pressure that, in itself, ends a lot of marriages without ending a life. What made this marriage different is what Dale Warner did about his suspicions. He believed his wife was having an affair, and rather than confront that suspicion directly, he spent years surveilling her. He asked an employee to clone her phone. He had another employee purchase a GPS tracker for her Hummer in 2020. A data analyst from General Motors later testified at trial that Dale had used a mobile phone application to check the location of his wife's Cadillac Escalade more than 2,100 times between January 2020 and April 2021. 2,100 times. That is not suspicion. That is obsession formalized into a routine, a habit, a daily ritual of checking where his wife was without her knowing he was checking. Police later discovered notebooks Dale had compiled, detailed records of his wife's activities, her stated opinions, fragments of her text conversations. He was not simply suspicious, he was documenting her, building a file on the woman he was married to, as though she were a subject under investigation rather than a spouse. Dee Warner's daughter, Rickle Bach, testified that her mother had been in what she described as an extremely toxic relationship with Dale. She said Dale stalked her mother, that he committed domestic violence against her. Dee's brother, Greg Hardy, would later say publicly that he had seen the signs his sister was being abused, but at the time, he had not understood what he was looking at. On April 24, 2021, the night before Dee disappeared, prosecutors say she told Dale she wanted a divorce. She wanted to sell the trucking business. That conversation, according to the prosecution's case, was the final pressure point in a marriage that had been building towards something for years. Whatever stability had existed in the relationship was finished. Dee had made her decision and communicated it directly to the man she had been married to for 15 years. She was reported missing the next day, April 25, 2021. For the first year, the investigation belonged to the Lenawee County Sheriff's Office. In August 2022, the Michigan State Police took over, and in November 2023, a year and a half after Dee vanished, and nearly 9 months before her body would be located, Dale Warner was arrested and charged with her murder. That sequence is worth sitting with. Investigators built a case sufficient to charge a man with murder before they had a body, before they had a confirmed cause of death, before they had anything except cell phone records, surveillance patterns, witness testimony, and a circumstantial picture they believed was strong enough to act on. That is an enormous legal and professional risk. Murder cases without a body are notoriously difficult to win. If Dee Warner had simply left, if she had run from a marriage that had become unbearable and was alive somewhere, unreachable by choice, the case against Dale Warner would have collapsed instantly and irreparably. They were betting everything on a conviction that required proving someone was dead without yet knowing where her remains were. One detail makes that bet make sense. Dee's daughter told investigators something her mother had said to her, something that has stayed with the family since. "I watch Dateline like every night, and he could do something like that to me." Dee Warner had told her own daughter before she disappeared that she believed her husband was capable of killing her. In March 2025, the case darkened further. Dale's son, Jaron Warner, was arrested and charged with tampering with evidence and being an accessory after the fact, suggesting investigators believed the cover-up may not have been a one-man operation. Those charges were ultimately dropped 2 months later, in May 2025, though the reasons behind that decision have never been fully explained publicly. On August 16, 2024, Michigan State Police executed a search warrant on Dale Warner's Paragon Road property. What they found, sealed inside a resealed anhydrous tank similar to a residential propane storage container, were human remains. Dental records confirmed weeks later that they belonged to Dee Warner. 3 years, 4 months. That is how long Dee Warner's body sat hidden on the property of the man who had been charged with her murder 9 months before anyone found her. The medical examiner who testified at trial determined that Dee died from strangulation and blunt force trauma to her head. Prosecutors introduced evidence at trial establishing that she had been beaten, strangled, and that her mouth and nose had been duct taped before her body was placed inside the tank. The defense argued throughout the trial that there was no concrete evidence connecting Dale to the act of killing his wife, that the prosecution's case was built on speculation, on circumstantial patterns, on the absence of an alternative explanation rather than the presence of direct proof. The trial ran for weeks in Lenawee County Circuit Court. Jurors heard from a Michigan State Police cell phone records analyst and the General Motors data investigator who walked them through the 2,100 location checks. They heard from Dee's former nanny and personal assistant, Madison Wolfe, who testified about the affair Dee had once had. Testimony the defense likely hoped would humanize an alternative motive, even as the prosecution used the same fact to establish what had driven Dale's obsessive surveillance in the first place. They heard from the lead detective. They heard from the medical examiner. They were transported to the crime scene itself, walking the property where Dee's remains had been hidden for 3 years. Jail calls were played for the jury during the trial, recordings of conversations Dale had while in custody, and a Michigan State Police investigator testified about something that added another layer of difficulty to an already complicated investigation: a document rift between the agencies involved. The case had moved from the Lenawee County Sheriff's Office to the Michigan State Police in 2022, a transfer that is not uncommon in long-running cases, but that can create friction over jurisdiction, evidence handling, and institutional memory. The investigator's testimony touched on how that rift affected the handling of information about how Dee's body had allegedly been concealed. A detail that suggests even with a body eventually found and a conviction eventually secured, the path to get there was not as clean or coordinated as the final outcome might suggest. A welding expert and a detective with the Lenawee County Sheriff's Office testified specifically about the tank itself, how it had been resealed, what that process would have required, and what it told investigators about premeditation. Welding both ends of a container shut is not a panicked, improvised action. It requires equipment, time, and a level of technical competence that a man who ran farming and trucking operations for years would have had ready access to. The same machinery and skills he used to run his business were the tools he used to permanently hide his wife's body. Now think about what you just heard, and we want to know what you think before we go further. A case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, cell phone pings, a welded tank, a pattern of obsessive surveillance, secured a guilty verdict in a marriage where the only direct witness to what happened is the man on trial. Does that level of circumstantial proof feel like enough to you? Or does this case make you uneasy about how murder convictions get built when there's no eyewitness at all? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. On Tuesday, March 10th, 2026, after deliberating for 9 hours across 2 days, a jury of 7 men and 5 women found Dale Warner guilty of second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. He buckled slightly when the verdict was read. His defense attorney, Mary Chartier, patted his arm as he became teary-eyed. In the gallery, Dee's relatives cried quietly and held each other. Greg Hardy, Dee's brother, had led what he called a 5-year campaign for justice, a campaign he had named Justice for Dee. Outside the courthouse, he told reporters he had fought every single day for 5 years. That validation had been difficult to come by, that progress had often felt invisible, and that it took nearly the entire process, right up until the very end, before he finally got what he had been fighting for. He said it now felt like victory for Dee. The sentencing hearing on May 7, 2026, produced some of the most raw and unfiltered victim impact testimony any Michigan courtroom had heard in years. Greg Hardy did not hold back. He called Dale Warner a narcissistic, psychopathic liar and murderer. He said Dale's lack of remorse for brutally killing his sister was unforgivable. He called the act of welding her into a tank barbaric, beyond human. He told Dale directly that he was a spineless piece of human debris, language pointed enough that Judge Michael Olsaver had to remind him to direct his comments to the court rather than to the defendant. Dee's sister-in-law, Shelley Hardy, removed a bracelet from her wrist that she had worn continuously since the day Dee was first reported missing. She placed it on the podium and said she was doing it because the family had finally gotten justice. Dee's daughter, Rickle Bach, described what her father had done to her mother in plain, unflinching terms. He brutally beat her, strangled her, and as if that were not enough, duct-taped her hands and mouth, wrapped her in a tarp, and hid her in a tank to conceal what he had done. She said he took away a beautiful soul. She said that throughout the entire trial, he showed no remorse and accepted no accountability. Dee's son, T.J. Bach, offered the sentence that may capture this case more completely than any other single statement made in that courtroom. "I did not want to believe he was capable of this," he said, "just as I did not want to believe my mother would ever leave without saying a word to us. But only one of those things was true." Judge Olsaver, calculating the appropriate sentence, looked specifically at what had been taken from Dee Warner. Assuming an average life expectancy, he noted she had approximately 29 years of life stolen from her. But he said it was not only the 29 years. It was everything those years would have contained. Relationships, milestones, the ordinary accumulation of a life that was instead cut off and hidden inside a sealed piece of farm equipment for 3 years while her family searched and waited and feared the worst without confirmation. He sentenced Dale Warner to a minimum of 31 years and a maximum of 60 years in prison for second-degree murder, plus an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence, the sentences to run consecutively. Combined, Dale Warner will not be eligible for parole for at least 33 years. He is 58 years old. If he survives to his earliest possible release date, he will be 91. Unfortunately, Judge Olsaver said before handing down the sentence, this is one of those tragedies where the chapter doesn't always end. Dee Warner disappeared on April 25, 2021. For 3 years, she existed in the worst possible category a missing person can occupy, neither confirmed alive nor confirmed dead, a case that technically remained open while everyone closest to her quietly understood what had almost certainly happened. Her brother spent 5 years fighting for a conviction before there was even a body to point to. Her daughter had heard her mother predict her own death months or years before it happened in a casual comment about a true crime show that turned out to be devastatingly prophetic. The tank is empty now. The remains are identified, buried, mourned. The man who welded it shut is serving a sentence that will keep him in prison for the rest of any reasonable life expectancy he has left. But there was no ammonia inside that tank when investigators finally opened it in August of 2024. There was a woman who had told her own daughter before any of this happened that her husband could do something like this to her. She was right. And the bracelet Shelley Hardy wore for 3 years, the one she finally removed and placed on the podium at the sentencing, had been a quiet daily act of waiting, worn through the months when no one knew if Dee was alive somewhere, choosing silence, or already gone. Worn through the arrest that came before the body, worn through the search warrant, the dental records, the identification, worn through a trial that asked 12 strangers to look at phone records and GPS pings and a sealed tank and decide, beyond reasonable doubt, what had happened to a woman none of them had ever met. It came off only when there was nothing left to wait for. Only when the chapter, as Judge Olsaver put it, had finally found whatever ending the law could give it, not the ending the family wanted, which would have been Dee Warner walking through her own front door. The ending the law could provide instead: a name, a verdict, a sentence, and a tank with nothing left inside it but the absence of the woman who had spent 3 years there before anyone came looking in the right place.